I'll record this and then go through it later and determine if we talked about anything particularly sensitive. In past courses, some people talk about, their periods or where they live or stuff like that, especially with the current administration, if that got published online. I don't really know what that would be like. So anyway, hi, my name is Amelia Sullivan, and I am a recent college graduate from the University of Connecticut. I majored in medical anthropology with a focus in women's reproductive health and in global health. I'm currently an employee at Planned Parenthood. So it's just kind of intersection of all my interests to talk about reproductive justice today. So we're gonna get started. Okay. So what does reproductive justice mean? So basically, this is a political movement that wants fair and equitable principles and procedures with regard to reproduction and childbearing. So what that means is there are three basic tenets of this movement. And the first one is the right to not have a child, which is important because bodily autonomy is essential. The second is the right to have a child. And the third is the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. So here are some terms to know. Pregnant person versus pregnant woman. Does anyone have any ideas about why this nuance might be important to make note of, especially in this field? Anyone have any ideas? Anyone want to like talk or raise their hand or put anything in the chat? Let me see here. Chat. Okay. Okay. Well, I am not seeing anything necessarily. I'm sorry if I can't see something, but basically the difference between those two terms is pregnant woman is kind of an exclusionary term, considering the fact that individuals such as, trans males that have been born with uteruses and non-binary people can also get pregnant. So just limiting it to pregnant women, it kind of excludes a whole category of people that can also get pregnant. Another term to know is abortion, and this basically refers to a termination of a pregnancy, either through procedural methods or through medication. Intersectionality is the acknowledgement and the acknowledgement that different people come into spaces at different levels of privilege and different levels of discrimination based off of things such as their race or their gender or their sexuality. For example, a Black woman versus a white woman, there would be different levels of privilege and ability to, have respect or gain access to various procedures. So reproductive rights is, of course, making sure that people have access to contraceptions and abortions and making sure that people are able to make the choices they want with their bodies. Gender versus sex, gender is more of a social and cultural construct that basically informs how a person, how they behave, how they act, how they dress, how they identify with themselves. And then sex refers more to, what reproductive organs somebody has, their chromosomal makeup. Though, of course, gender identity and sex can be two different things, and that is completely valid and okay. And then, of course, Roe versus Wade, which is, a landmark Supreme Court case from 1973 that gave people the right to have an abortion. So how does reproductive justice intersect with our lives? So there are a lot of things called, social determinants of health. And what that basically means is based off of your socioeconomic class or, non-medical things, you have different levels of care, levels of health, and levels of ability to take care of yourself and your family. So these can include things such as environment, education, housing, food, and social welfare. So, if you live somewhere that is right by a factory and the air is polluted and you're really sick all the time, your ability to be healthy and to have children and to raise a family would be impacted. Another example is education. If you are able to have access to quality education, it is more likely that you'll be able to, get a good job and afford to live in a better area. So then you can better provide for your family. Other things such as, housing or food, like if you're in an unsafe area or a neighborhood, it's just all these different factors that go into how people have access to health and care and how it kind of impacts them over time. So we already talked about this a little bit, but framework of ideals for reproductive justice, people can read it on their own, but basically it's just, people have a right to a standard of living that's adequate for health and care for themselves and their family, including the social determinants of health that I mentioned, and then some other factors as well. So, a brief history of abortion practices and views in ancient times, the 19th century. So, as long as people have been getting pregnant for, there have been abortions because people want control of their bodies and, their ability to have, babies or not is completely up to that person. So, in ancient times, there were a lot of methods that pregnant people would use, including taking toxic substances such as mercury, lily, rue, or ivy, as well as typically people would engage in strenuous activity, strenuous manual labor to kind of make their bodies, stress their bodies out, and then, sort of induce an abortion that way. And a common misconception that a lot of people have is that the most liberal and the most progressive views on abortion exist today. And that's actually not the case. In colonial America, abortion up to 20 weeks was seen as permissible, and it wasn't seen as an abortion or whatever other misconceptions there are around abortion, such as abortion is murder, abortion is killing a baby. It was really just seen as restoring the menses or restoring the period of the person. Um, so in the 19th century, there was a shift from skilled Black female midwives to white male gynecologists, and sort of the medicalization of the field ensued. There was also a rising of nativist movements and the promotion of white supremacy in the United States. As I'm sure all of you are aware, the United States has really deep roots in white supremacy, racism, and slavery. So, also the end of slavery. So there are shifting views on profit and childbirth. So basically, prior to the emancipation of slaves in the United States, there was this pressure and this, widespread assault on Black women that were enslaved to have as many kids as possible because then they could be sold and profitable. But then after slavery ended in the United States, there was a massive shift in how that was seen because suddenly we can't profit off of these Black bodies and they're seen as undesirable. So instead of that, we really want to promote the idea of a white nation and to ensure that, we're getting rid of as many Black and brown bodies as possible, unfortunately. And then another important thing to note is the Comstock Act of 1873. And that was a series of federal laws that passed, led by the, I guess, religious fanatic Anthony Comstock. And what this did basically was it was it's funny how people can twist laws. The basis of the Comstock Act was to prevent the sharing and distribution of pornographic images and ideas through the mail system. But as a result of that, what is pornography? How do we determine that? So that can also, especially with a more conservative government, that can also extend to, information about abortion or about, reproduction or how to be safe or condoms. So it really started to limit people's access to getting accurate information about their bodies and access to contraceptions and just, general information about like how to go about that safely. So that was a huge thing, unfortunately, that kind of impacted a lot of people. So that was kind of like ancient times in the 19th century in the United States. So, grand/granny midwives, who were granny midwives? So granny midwives basically came out of a long tradition of Black slave women attending to themselves and to other women around them during, pregnancy and childbirth. And this is essential because obviously, as slaves, they didn't really have access to, I guess, white male doctors. They didn't have access to traditional medicine. So it was important, or I shouldn't say traditional, I should say Western medicine. So they had to resort to taking care of themselves and to passing down traditions from Africa and their homeland to help keep each other safe. And these were highly skilled women. And, they were so good at their jobs and making sure that people were being taken care of during this time that, they were often summoned to deliver Black babies and also white babies. So after, the emancipation of slavery, these practices continued until, unfortunately, what happened to these midwives was this massive smear campaign by the United States government and the start of the gynecological and obstetrics field of medicine in the United States. Basically, a bunch of problematic, racist, white male gynecologists were suggesting, they weren't suggesting, they were explicitly saying that these midwives were unskilled, they were dirty, they were problematic, they're witches, we can't trust them. Um, and it wrested control of that away from midwives as people that used to be respected in their communities, and now they're being dismissed and their knowledge and ideas are being diminished to the point where a lot of it got lost, unfortunately. So then there was a shift in childbirth being seen as a natural phenomenon, something medicalized. And what medicalized means is basically a natural process of being a human. For example, grieving after a loved one or a pregnancy is seen as something that has to be treated or cured or assessed versus seen as a natural thing that is occurring. For example, after somebody dies and someone is grieving, instead of acknowledging that they're grieving, it might be more of a focus on, oh, well, you know, you're depressed and this isn't natural and we're going to give you antidepressants, which like certainly can help people. But it just sort of jumps over that idea of, I guess, humanity and looking at how these things are all very human practices, like, you know, childbirth is such a human thing to do. So this is just a quote by a well-known doula. So one of the darkest moments in US history was the systematic eradication of the African-American midwife from her community, resulting in a legacy of birth injustices. So this is the problematic doctor that is considered the father of gynecology. So Dr. James Marion Sims, he performed experiments on enslaved Black women in Alabama beginning in 1844. Obviously, because they were slaves, their bodies were being owned, and there was no consent, there was no anesthesia, and he performed, dozens of surgeries on these women without their consent, and they were really brutal and painful. And due to a lot of racist problematic ideas at the time about how Black people were able to withstand a lot of pain, it kind of just further underscored the idea that these women, not only were they not able to consent, but why would we use medicine or anesthesia on them? Like, it's kind of a waste of time, which is obviously not correct. And then later, Sims also extended his surgical work to poor Irish immigrant women in the North because they were similarly seen as dirty and able to withstand a lot of physical pain. So this is the problematic person that is considered to be the father of gynecology, and it's just really unfortunate and awful. And I think really telling of the field that even though gynecology has come so far, the roots are so bloody and so problematic, and yeah, just built on the backs of Black enslaved women. So these are the mothers of gynecology. So these are the women that were being experimented on without their consent. And we like to honor them and acknowledge them because of their sacrifice. And we can't go back and change the history of this, unfortunately, but we can acknowledge them. So their names are Inarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. So they were some of the enslaved women that were being experimented on, and we just like to acknowledge them. So reproductive laws and views in the 20th century in the United States. So by 1910, there has been this huge shift in how abortion is seen and access to abortion in the United States. As you'll recall, during colonial times, abortion was permissible and acceptable up to 20 weeks. But by 1910, abortion is restricted everywhere in the country. And it's, the access to abortion has been very limited. And then in 1927, there was a Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, which some of you might be familiar with. But basically, it was a ruling that said that people that were disabled or considered feeble-minded, they could be sterilized without their consent. And this led to, sort of the promotion of the eugenics movement in the United States and also abroad. And what this did basically was people could be forcibly sterilized without their consent. And, this led to more than 60,000 non-consensual sterilizations of individuals. So a lot of states at this time did have an exception to an abortion that if their life was at stake, they could get an abortion. But of course, that was up to the doctor. And at this time, most, if not all of the doctors that were in the United States, they were, white male doctors. So again, it's sort of women's and pregnant people's access to this is being restricted by, white males in positions of authority. It's not to say that all white men are problematic or bad, of course, but, there is that long history of privilege and class and race that kind of intersects to position white males at the top of the patriarchal pyramid rather, excuse me. So anyway, in America, it also experienced several decades of increased immigration. And as a result of that, there was this more of this push again, as we'll call the nativist movements of trying to make the United States as white as possible, to make it a white nation. So we definitely want to prevent white women from being able to have abortions, because if they have abortions, there are less white babies in the country. So it's this really problematic intersection of race and class, because of course, white wealthy women, generally will always be able to get access to abortion because of their status, their class, their privilege, and their monetary abilities. So, as someone who works at Planned Parenthood and, someone who has studied Margaret Sanger and her work, so Margaret Sanger, she was a reproductive rights activist in the United States, and she was incredibly influential and important to the movement. But it is really important to acknowledge as well that she was a supporter of eugenics. And the eugenics movement is basically trying to determine and trying to cull the population based off of desirable or undesirable things, such as like if someone was disabled, or they were a particular race, or they, had a particular heritage or background. So the fact that she supported this and promoted these perspectives, and as the founder of Planned Parenthood, I think it's really important to acknowledge that her views, of course, are really problematic. And I feel for a long time, the organization has kind of swept her under the rug and her, the darker side of Margaret Sanger a little bit. And, it is complicated because on the one hand, she did so much work for the movement and she helped to progress, women's rights and, reproductive rights. And that's really important. But on the other hand, supporting eugenics and being kind of racist, like one might argue, a devil's advocate might argue that, oh, she was desperate to get these, things passed, to get birth control more widely, readily available, women's bodies, having more autonomy. So one could argue that for sure, that she might have hitched her wagon to this movement to help promote her own cause and kind of piggyback off of it. But, the end result might have been successful, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, she was in support of this movement, which is really problematic because disabled people, who's to say or define what disabled is? Like disabled people have the same rights to autonomy and their bodies and their reproductive health as anybody else. And a lot of disabled people, they actually have similar, obviously they have similar desires to reproduce and have families like non-disabled people. So it's important to acknowledge that disability comes in a lot of shapes and forms. And as a result of that, sterilizing people without their consent because of predetermined ideas from this state is incredibly problematic. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and talk about her really quickly. So then there are a lot of movements popping up in the 20th century, such as the Jane Collective, which is an underground abortion network in Chicago that operated from 1969 to 1973. So I was talking a little bit about Margaret Sanger in the last slide, but one can argue that the women's health movement started in the early 20th century with activists such as her, fight for women's rights to birth control. But of course, there is the history of this, the problematic history of this does continue because there were trials being conducted on Puerto Rican women in the 1950s to basically test the efficacy of birth control. And because they were not given, there was no informed consent given by these women, and they were not really properly educated about the side effects. A lot of them ended up with a lot of harm, blood clots, and headaches and nausea and increased health risks and issues, and it kind of eroded that trust. And also it's important to note that there is a long history of exploitation and testing on women in the global south, and also push for women in those areas to get sterilized, because if they're sterilized then they can't have babies, and then if they can't have babies they can be more efficient workers. So to this day, Puerto Rico has one of the highest rates of tubal ligation, which is when a woman or a person ties their tube so they cannot get pregnant, because even though birth control today is a lot safer than it was in the 1950s, that generational trauma and harm has been passed down. So there's, a heightened mistrust of doctors and birth control, unfortunately. So in 1960, the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive called Enovid. And, again, the dosage at this time was too high, unfortunately, but, through decades of experimenting and trials and, modification of dosage. Today birth control is a lot safer, pills are a lot safer. Though of course, a lot of birth control pills, they give a heightened risk of, like blood clots and other side effects such as those. So it's, there's no birth control without, some sort of issue or side effect. Unfortunately, that's, hormonally based. And then in 1965, Griswold v. Connecticut was a Supreme Court case that ruled that birth control for married people was, acceptable because they had the right to privacy to use birth control pills with, their doctor and a prescription. And then in 1969, the doctor's case against the pill was published, and it was written by Barbara Seaman, who is a health columnist. And unfortunately, as a result of this whistleblowing, she did lose her job. But basically, she writes about how unsafe the pill is at this time. And she sort of calls attention to the fact that, the dosage of the hormones in these pills is way too high. And they're sort of looking at the dark side of birth control. It's not really talked about at this time. So she was a whistleblower, and she, lost her job was as a result of this. But like as a result of her publishing this, there was more awareness being passed as a result of this, and people were more aware of this, so they were able to put more regulation safety procedures in place for birth control. And there's also another Supreme Court case called Eisenstadt v. Bard in 1972, and that basically gave unmarried people the same access to birth control that, married people had, because it was ruled as unconstitutional, because why can only married people get birth control but unmarried people cannot? And then, in 1973, Roe versus Wade was legalized. And, this made sure that people would have access to abortion everywhere in the country and have that right to privacy. And then in 1976, the Hyde Amendment was passed, and that has a problematic history we'll talk about in the next slide. And then there's also the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, which made it illegal to fire people based off of whether they're pregnant or not. Because before that, it was legal to do that, because if your worker is pregnant, it means they will have to go maternity leave, and they'll have to, leave work for a while. And employers often did not want to accommodate that or pay for maternity leave. So the Hyde Amendment is unfortunately still being renewed every year to this day. And basically, it prevents people who are on, Medicaid and federal aid for healthcare from accessing abortion and abortion care. So what does this mean? People on Medicaid are often, they're poor, or they have more limited resources because they're on federal funding and they're reliant off of that. So if you're making it harder for people of lower socioeconomic classes of getting access to abortion, that is disastrous, because then if an abortion is, say, $800 and your rent is $800 in a month, you're left with the tough decision of making between, do I want to be homeless or do I want to have an abortion? So it's really unfortunate this, was passed, and it's still in effect today. And so basically what that means is that it's up to the states to determine whether they're going to support this or not. Like I know in Connecticut, a woman or a person on Medicaid, they can get an abortion because Connecticut has a special fund set aside to make sure that happens. Also, do we have any questions so far? I feel like I know it's a lot of history. Do we have any questions, any comments, any things we want to share? Okay, well, if anyone thinks of anything, let me know. So reproductive rights and laws in the 1980s, the 1990s. In 1986, the NIH adopted a policy that required the inclusion of women in clinical research. Up to this time, it was not a requirement. So most trials would be done on, assigned male with birth bodies. And of course, you may imagine that's problematic because a lot of times, due to variances in hormone levels or, body size or body mass, there could be different side effects being reported by different people. So excluding a whole category of people is really problematic. So the NIH Revitalization Act, which mandated that women and minorities be included in clinical research, was funded by the NIH, and then the FMLA Act, which was the Family Medical Leave Act, was put into law on February 5th, 1993, and the FMLA was a key part of Clinton's first term domestic agenda. So the 2000s to the present day, Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015 was basically a Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage in the United States. And it led to, not only the ability to get legally married, but also to be able to legally adopt as well. Because before this time, a lot of adoption agencies would not let gay couples adopt because they were like, oh, they would exploit loopholes such as, oh, you're not legally married, so we don't give children that need to be adopted to people that are not married. So by, making that a legal thing, it certainly was, it opened up the doors to both marriage and also to adoption, depending on where you live and what state you're in. And then Dobbs v. Jackson in 2022, which was the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which is really unfortunate because now we live in a post-Roe society. And in some states, such as Texas, abortion is completely illegal. So it's really awful how many preventable deaths and complications will ensue as a result of that. And that people have already been dying as a result of this. And there really is not an exception for an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy that can never be viable no matter what. And it is a pregnancy that occurs outside of the uterus, which is the womb where things are supposed to be implanted. So it could be in the fallopian tubes, it can be in the ovaries, it can implant somewhere that it's not supposed to. And then as a result of that, as the fetus starts to get larger and larger, it will eventually rupture or burst the tubes or burst the ovary. And then that will, it's fatal for the person carrying this. So, the fact that there really isn't sort of a legal guideline or a legal protection or safety net for that is also really problematic. And then I'm sure many of you have heard about Project 2025. And that has been very difficult to contend with as well. So, it promotes a presidential agenda that rolls back civil and human rights, and it implements extremist conservative policies across every federal and department and agency. So, some of these restrictions that they're trying to put in place include, eliminating access to mifepristone, which is the second, it's the first drug that's given during a medication abortion. So often what happens is a person is given mifepristone first within our office or wherever they're doing it. And then they have to take misoprostol, which is the second medication, about 24 to 48 hours after the fact. Mifepristone is the pill that basically stops the pregnancy from developing. It kind of terminates it. And then the misoprostol, what that does is it basically helps to expel the pregnancy tissue out of the uterus and create contractions that sort of simulate childbirth. So both of them are really essential and really important because, you have to stop the pregnancy and then you have to get it out of the body. So, eliminating access to mifepristone, it's really problematic and really bad, especially because we have a lot of options for, mail order abortions, such as there's something called Plan C and sort of like Plan B, sort of like that idea of, stopping a person from ovulating. Plan C is an online pharmacy that basically will send people abortion pills in the mail, which is very, it's a good way to do it. It's a self-managed at-home abortion. So eliminating access to those medications is, disastrous for a lot of people that, maybe they can't afford to take a day or two off from work and, go to an abortion clinic or something like that. So then in some cases, misoprostol only abortions are also a possibility. And someone just has to take those pills every 4 hours until they expel the tissue. So we're already at Planned Parenthood already talking about like what that might look like if misoprostol does indeed get, ruled as an illegal drug that we can't really use anymore. So yeah, a lot of planning around that. And then it's so many things to overturn and overrule and kind of rolling back healthcare regulations and history, or I'm sorry, regulate like just sort of like going back in history to a time where, abortion is not really widespread safe practice. But there's so many other ways that Project 2025 is impacting all of us. So I wanted to pull this up. I'm not sure where everyone's coming from, but this interactive abortion map was really interesting. So kind of looking at, where is the most restrictive and where is the least restrictive in the country. So we can kind of see, orange is most restrictive and then like a dark blue is most protective. But just looking down here at, Connecticut is considered like a protective state and abortion is banned at fetal viability, generally 24 to 26 weeks of pregnancy. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just, we have more protections than most states at this time, unfortunately. And then let's look at Texas and compare this to Texas. Okay, most restrictive. So it is completely banned, limited exceptions, and patients are forced to make 2 trips. Some states, what they do basically to kind of make people see if they can make them change their minds about having an abortion is there's often a mandatory waiting period of 24 or more hours in some states. And then also, of course, making 2 trips, that's you're taking time from work. And, it's just kind of, I'd say a big waste of a patient's time because they're trying to undermine and erode a patient's, sense of autonomy. And this is what they want to do with their body. So just wanted to pull that up. But yeah, as you look at the map, like it's really not looking awesome. I mean, it's good to know that some states are still very protective, like, California and Vermont. Let's see what Vermont has for their policies. I know Vermont is very protective. Yep, so I figured as much. Abortion is not restricted based on gestational duration. So what that means is if someone wanted to have an abortion in their third term, pregnancy is split into 3 trimesters, trimester 1, 2, and 3. So trimester 3 is, up to the last trimester of pregnancy. So if somebody wanted to get an abortion in that time, it wouldn't be restricted. A common stereotype or myth that some people have that they believe is that people that have abortions during their third trimester, they're baby killers or they're monsters. But by and large, it is an incredibly painful and grueling process for a patient because by your third trimester, as many of you might imagine, you're expecting this baby, you're excited about this baby, you can't wait to have this baby. But a lot of times at this point, doctors are able to screen and figure out if there are any um, things that are wrong with the fetus that would then impair its quality of life, whether, some cases are, if a baby's born, if a baby has a brain inside of its head, or it's something wrong with the heartbeat, or there's some like major issue with the fetus that would then it wouldn't be able to survive outside of the womb, or it would kill the mother or the pregnant person, the pregnant parent, I should say, and the fetus as well. So like it's certainly by that point, you're so far along in your pregnancy, like you're excited about this, you want this, you've committed to this. So just there's a misconception around that, but it's really more about, the viability of the fetus and the safety of the pregnant person. So it's a really painful decision that a lot of people have to make. So, not restricting that is like the best practice, I feel like, because then people can make choices accordingly based off of their bodies and what's best for them. Do we have any questions? Vivian, do you see anyone that has questions? Like, I don't know if you see my screen, but like, I can't see all the participants right now, so I'm not sure. Any questions?
I don't see any in the chat, so.
Okay, right. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about positive rights versus negative rights. So positive rights are legal requirement to provide access and requires institution or organization to actively provide a service such as abortion. And then a negative right is you're legally not required to support or provide services, but you basically don't stand in the way of someone wanting to get something done or do something. So it protects autonomy to, make choices, but it doesn't create long-term support for people that, might need an abortion or other medical procedure or practice. And an issue a lot of people, a lot of reproductive justice activists and organizers had with Roe versus Wade is Roe versus Wade talks more about it's basically it's a negative right. You know, it supports a person's right to have an abortion, but it's basically more of a privacy thing if the government won't interfere with this. But are they providing, funds for this? No. Are they providing, travel services or a larger safety net for people that have maybe something's going on in their life that, they might need more support? And the answer is no. And that's why a lot of activists feel like Roe was only supposed to be the beginning of, more equitable access to abortion and reproductive rights and, access to reproductive freedom. Because if you're just saying someone can get something, but you're not really helping to institutionally and, nationally support them in that, you're going to have people falling through the gaps that, maybe can't afford to get an abortion or, some other factors at play here. So it's like, it's problematic and interesting to think about because I think a lot of people get overly focused on Roe versus Wade. And while it is an incredibly important, Supreme Court decision that was enacted, it was only supposed to be the beginning of a more robust reproductive justice movement. So by just limiting somebody to that and not really going beyond that of, let's say, federal, access to childcare, that's being paid for by the government, or, sort of more access to better education or more access to abortion. Like it's only the beginning. And we kind of fell short in that, unfortunately, because people kind of got Roe versus Wade and then we're like, progress has been made. And then it kind of didn't keep moving forward. The ball didn't keep moving forward, unfortunately. And now with the Supreme Court ruling from 2022, we've kind of seen this, the pendulum's kind of swung back the other way because now we're living in post-Roe United States of America. So now people can't generally get an abortion depending on where they are in the country. So it's a lot to think about for sure. So, what do we do now? There are so many things that we as individuals can do. I feel like a lot of times we feel incredibly powerless to do more because we're just one person, right? But, it's really important to note that rollbacks can happen anywhere in the country. I mean, this is not directly related to this, but I know that some medical groups in the Connecticut have already rolled back providing gender affirming hormone therapy in their location. I know that Connecticut Children's they rolled back their, I guess their practicing of doing that. Like that just happened this week, unfortunately. So it's just really important because, people that, are on, hormone therapy that want to feel more like themselves and have that gender affirming care are no longer able to do so. So it's definitely, it's not directly related to abortion itself, but it is kind of that overarching umbrella of, what rights people have, what rights people not have. And, it's just interesting how those things they do intersect. So yeah, these rollbacks, they definitely can happen in Connecticut. And we are much more purple state than a blue state. So purple state is basically a state that is more of an even split between like Republicans and Democrats because, red and blue makes purple, So it's certainly interesting to think about that and remember that. I know that some folks are coming from other places like, New York and Massachusetts. So I'm sure, rights can't be taken for granted anywhere. It's also important to note that you should definitely never discuss sensitive medical information such as your period, abortion, etc., over unsecured lines or apps, such as iMessage or Instagram. I mean, Meta, which is the organization that owns Facebook and Instagram, they can and they will surveil our phones and any message we send on them. Consider that, Zuckerberg and all of those people can kind of see what you're doing a little bit. It's also important to support and donate to abortion funds. There are so many funds that are both like local and on the national scale of things. It's also important to join pro-choice rallies in your area. Generally, we use the term pro-abortion now because it kind of destigmatizes the term abortion because pro-choice means, you can do whatever you want with your body. You can choose to have, a baby, you can choose to not have a baby. But by saying pro-abortion, it kind of centers it further on that idea that, it is choosing to have an abortion or not. And that's totally, either option is totally okay. It's also important that if you are at a protest and you get arrested, to, stay silent, don't talk to the police, don't sign anything without a lawyer present. Like it goes without saying, but like a lot of people don't really think about like how problematic the police state is in the United States of America. And, they're not your friends, they're not on your side. And, they would love to, you know, get you for something and throw you in jail. It's also important to, stay proactive on the political side. So calling your representatives, telling them that abortion and reproductive rights and access are really important to people. That's super important as well, because if people in power don't think that we care about this, why would they throw their weight and their political support behind things? And to that point, voting for politicians that will protect reproductive rights is very important as well. And that's becoming more and more important. Um, and if anyone ever needed access to this, I'm not telling you what you can or can't do, and I'm not suggesting, anything, but Plan B, which is, a very helpful thing in helping to prevent pregnancy, it does have a shelf life of about 4 years, and it is safe and effective in stopping a pregnancy as long as a person is not currently ovulating. So yeah, it's just important to keep note of that and what access people have to things, because it's very uncertain right now what's going to happen with the current administration. And it's a really tough time, to be honest. Like, I'm not sure if any of you keep up with the news, but they're currently trying to defund Planned Parenthood, which is where, I work and so many people work. And, we provide that really essential care. So many other organizations do, make sure people can do what they want with their bodies. And I think a common misconception a lot of people have about Planned Parenthood is that we only do abortions. And it's simply not the case. It's not true. We also provide, STI screenings, and we do gender affirming hormone therapy. And we certainly have male patients come in a lot of the times. Like, I would say probably at the center I work at, probably a fifth of our patients are, men. So it's definitely not just, women seeking our services or people that are pregnant. We do all kinds of things. We educate people about their bodies and their everything they can do with their bodies and what's safe. We also do, cancer screenings, and we also, do like IUD insertions and implants. And it's just, there's so much work that goes on that's not just abortion. And that's not to say that abortion is not an essential service as well. But I think a lot of people get really hung up on that idea that it's only an abortion place, and that's we do so much more than that. And so many other places do as well. So yeah, it's really important to just know your rights and stay proactive, and make sure that you are creating community and that you're safe, and that you're definitely not sharing any sensitive information online or anything. So yeah, I definitely could say more. When I was making these slides, there is so much about this topic that's so important to share and talk about. Like, I thought about including like a portion about like sex ed, and I thought about like there's just so much background and history behind all of this. And I think an education is the best way to kind of know that we can do better and that we can hope for a better future, because um if you're not aware of the history of where all these laws and ideas come from, how can you possibly make an informed choice or know that things can be different in the future? So yeah, I think that was all that I had that was formal. Like, I don't have any more slides of this other. I did want to acknowledge my one of my, oh, I forgot I had this. So these are suggested readings and apps for people, because there's so much more to learn about this. So there are a couple of books that I've read on here that I think are excellent, and they're really good resources. So Reproductive Justice by Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger is an excellent introduction to this movement. Liberating Abortion and Jane Against the World are also two really excellent resources. And then I know a lot of period tracking apps, they will sell your data to third-party sources, or they would be willing to collaborate with the police and the government to kind of figure out who's ovulating, who's having their period, like what's going on, and kind of use that data to prosecute people that are having abortions. Because if you can keep track of that, then you can figure out like, oh, this person might have had an abortion or they might have had a miscarriage, we're going to prosecute them. So Yuki is a period tracking app that only stores your data on your phone, and it does not share the information to third parties. And then Telegram is an app that a lot of my activist friends use. I used as well. And it's an encrypted app where you can discuss this information, such as abortion or things like that. And it will not be screened or surveilled by Apple, Meta, the US government, anything like that. So yeah, that is all that I had. But when I do this in person, I feel like we also leave time for discussion and for people to share their own questions or their own ideas, their own experiences. I kind of wanted to leave a couple minutes for that as well. So I'm going to open this up. Does anyone want to talk about anything they learned? Do you have any questions, any ideas, any concerns? I'll check the chat as well. See. Oh, there's nothing in the chat. All right. Well, I hope that you all learned something new and interesting today. I know it's a lot of information all at once, but I think it's really important to learn and share that information with the people because it's a really important thing to learn about, especially during the current administration and what's going on. Also, I know people often tend to harp on how terrible Republicans are. Democrats have had decades to, codify Roe versus Wade into law so that it can never be overturned. And by them always dangling abortion over people's heads, like, oh, if you vote for us, we won't take away your right to abortion. Like, they're also very problematic. And they also have a lot of issues as well, because, to kind of make that a political issue, dangle people's heads for so long, it's really problematic in and of itself. So, yeah. All right. Well, I guess take a few minutes to collect yourself, maybe get some water, take a couple of deep breaths. I know a lot is going to be really heavy, can bring up a lot of big emotions about people, especially like if they have people they know in their life that might be in less progressive or safe areas, or people in their families that might have had abortions at some point. So, but thank you all so, so, so much for spending an hour with me today. I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry for the technical issues at the beginning of this. I don't really know what happened, but I'm really happy we're able to talk about all of this and is able to share stuff.